Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of 100 Words or Less, the podcast. I'm your host, Ray Harkins. Thank you for joining us today. I am feeling much better. I've been sick over the past couple episodes. Now I'm feeling good. Got rid of the summer cold allergy bullshit that was going around. So I am my less nasally self now. The guest for today is one that I'm particularly excited about, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Sam McPheeters, the vocalist for Born Against, Wrangler Brutes, and he's also a very prolific writer as well. So more on him in a minute. PropertyofZach.com. Great website. They're our partners. We love working with them. I can't say anything more about them because they're so great, but I will. Go there for all the latest news, reviews, features, whatever you want in independent music. Go there, and you'll probably be able to find it. So check it out. We love them. They love us, etc., etc. And go visit our website, 100wordspodcast.com, where you can find random stuff that I find interesting online in between shows. And that way you can be constantly entertained because after all, we are in a culture that you need to have millions and millions of distractions. And I want to be one of those distractions. And if you're feeling ever so kind, go to the iTunes store, give us a review, drop some stars, get some nice sentences together, and then you can post it. And it'll make us look cooler in iTunes. So I appreciate if you do that. And shout out to our editor, Tom Richfield. He's been doing a great job and continues to kill it for the show. So thank you, Tom. Let's talk about something else before we dive into the interview. I don't know why this has been on my mind, but I've had a note to talk about this for a long time. But there's a very influential author in my own life, and I think anybody who is interested in technology and culture would find his work very appealing and revealing. His name is Neil Postman. The book that you should check out is called Technopoly. It's, I can't remember exactly when it was published, but I want to say it was right as the internet started to take shape, so late 80s, early 90s. And he wrote about the way that we interact with technology. And this is, way before social networks and Twitter and Facebook and everything else. The question you always have to ask yourself, or when you incorporate a new piece of technology into your life, whatever it may be, it can be something as simple as a blender or something as complex as our smartphones. What do we give up? And is what we're giving up worth the trade-off? And so that's a question I constantly ask myself because I've become obsessed with technology over the past, 7 to 8 years. And I always keep that in the back of my mind with whatever else I'm doing. Am I forgetting something? Am I not thinking about the impacts that it has on my life with whatever new gadget thing that I'm incorporating? But he passed away late 90s. I want to say 97. But it was pretty incredible because I wrote him a letter. He didn't write me a letter. He actually emailed me, which I was shocked at because I thought he might have problems with email. He wrote me back, and I still have that email printed out, and I thought it was very kind of him to do that. I got introduced to this dude via a band called Buried Inside. They were on Relapse Records. Great band if you are a fan of like ISIS, any sort of progressive metal, post-metal, whatever lame genre you want to put on it. The vocalist introduced me to this guy, and one of their records pulls some of his themes out and uses it throughout the record. The record's called Chronoclast, by the way. Basically, all I'm trying to do is give you a recommendation because we are at this age, this apex of technology, and like how I'm talking to you right now, this is incredible. But am I forsaking having this person-to-person conversation? Because sometimes I have these conversations over Skype or over the telephone, and it's a bummer that I have to do that, but for the sake of either my schedule or the person I'm interviewing, their schedule, that's sometimes just how it works. So anyways, just food for thought. Sam McPheeters, in a similar fashion, I wrote him a letter because he puts up some barriers for people to get in contact with him. In the age of internet and Facebook messaging and email, it's very easy to get in contact with people. And so I saw this and I was like, I've always wanted to interview him, but, I don't know him. I don't know any of my friends that have direct contact with him. So I was like, I'm just going to write him a letter. He doesn't live far from me, wrote me back, emailed me. And I even put a self-addressed stamp envelope in there. And when he wrote me an email, he said, I figured this was quicker. I'm sorry to have wasted your stamp. I thought that was very charming. I was like, oh, okay. Because, I figured since I was writing a letter to him that he may want to write a letter back. So we scheduled a time to talk. I was very nervous about this one because for anybody that doesn't know, I mean, Born Against is a very seminal, legendary band in the punk and hardcore movement. They ruffled a lot of feathers. They created some amazing music. So go back in the history books. You can Google Born Against and you'll be able to find some great stuff. So yeah, I was a little nervous walking into this because I didn't know how he was as a person, if he was going to be some, bitter old dude and not wanting to kind of walk through his life, because sometimes people don't want that. And that's what I'm trying to accomplish here. But Sam was amazing, very gracious to answer all of the questions that I, tried to spin in some original sense, but it was really good. And I was very, very proud of this interview. And with that being said, enjoy it, and I'll talk to you afterwards. Okay.
Dude, I'm feeling this. I like this.
The 44-cent barrier, yes.
It is. I like that. Is that how you view that?
Yeah, more or less. That was one of the biggest quality of life decisions I ever made, was ending any way for anyone to reach me publicly except by mail.
Yeah.
I used to get a lot of drunk emails from fans of bands I've been in, and all that stopped. No one sends drunk letters.
No. There's way too many steps to complete that. There's this cultural critic like this, and honestly, he was the last letter that I wrote to. It's this guy named Neil Postman. He used the same sort of idea where it was like, oh, if you want any sort of correspondence, you have to write. And so I did, and he wrote back, and it was like, when you have that sort of, hand-to-hand communication, it's just like, oh, it's brilliant. It's so nice.
I think most people, I don't know, of the younger generation are just baffled and angered by it. Yeah, it's been great.
Yeah.
Made my life a lot better.
That's good. Well, I'm glad. I mean, I'm 32 years old. I definitely got introduced to you and via Born Against. Like, would you say that's like your most common entry point where people are like, oh yeah, I know you because of that?
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
And so I definitely remember, getting Rebel Sound of Shit and Failure. It was one of those things that's like, I want to say it was like 14 or 15 years old, and I just started to understand that there was a political nature into what bands were doing, because prior to that, it was like my only exposure was like Rage Against the Machine. And so between you guys and Propagandhi, which is I'm sure not a direct comparison that you've maybe ever correlated in your own head, but once that kind of opened my head, where I was like, oh wow, this is meaningful to someone that is a little bit older than me and was doing this, before my proverbial time, because this was like the mid-90s. Your most common entry point was obviously Born Against for people who are familiar with your work. The attraction to be in a band, where did that come from?
I had been going to shows for a long time. I grew up in upstate New York, in Albany. Had done everything else that I could do. Did a lot of fanzines, set up shows. Very briefly had a radio show. Did all the stuff that I could do. And I always assumed that there's no way I could ever be in a band because I had a weird medical condition that's actually come back recently. Optical migraines. I don't know if you ever heard of those.
No.
It's where you have migraines, but you don't get the headaches. So
how does it manifest itself?
You get flashing lights. So I could be out driving or shopping, and I'll see a little light in the center of my vision, and I'll know what's going on, and then everything has to stop, and I just go sit in the car, or if I'm at home, I go sit on the couch. Precisely a half hour of just bright flashing lights. I'm functionally blind.
Wow.
And then it goes away. For most people, 95% of the people who get these, they know that's their signal. Batten down the hatches, and they're going to get a full-blown migraine headache, and the rest of the day or the next couple days are shot. I don't get the headaches. I just get the flashing lights. There are different symptoms. You can get these weird spells where you can't speak right. Your motor coordination can be off. I've only had a little tiny bit of that. Mostly it's just the lights. But I assumed from that I'd never be able to be in a band. I had that a lot when I was in my early teens. And then I started going to shows when I was 15, 16. That went on for a long time. That was just this feeling of, God, it's a real shame involved in all this other stuff, but I could never actually sing in a band. So I was friends with all the guys in the band Life's Blood, and when that band fell apart, I said, well, let's just go to the practice space. I'll do a set, and we'll see what happens. And the worst case scenario, you'll have to take me in the hospital. Of some weird seizure. It'll be a funny story for everyone.
Right.
And then I did it, and nothing happened.
Did that conversation going into the practice, you basically were like, all right, guys, there's a strong possibility that some weird shit's gonna happen with me.
It was just like a little mild preparation conversation. Yeah.
Sure.
I was definitely nervous. And I've been nervous for the first couple shows that you get the feeling where you can't entirely trust yourself physically, like you might have a seizure or something, even though seizures are not part of this.
Right. I identify with that because I sang for bands for years, but I had, and I still do, I have asthma. Not the most prudent choice for me to be like, oh yeah, I'll be the lead screamer for my band. So yeah, I know that feeling. Like, fortunately, I've been able to, medicate myself to where it's like those asthma attacks are few and far between. But I can understand where you're coming from, where it's just like, yeah, I trust my body, but some weird shit may happen.
How does that work? Have you had an asthma attack mid-set?
I have never, fortunately, I've never endured that, but I've definitely had after you play where it's like, I kind of have to like decompress and like sort of run outside immediately and just be able to like collect myself. There are ways that I've been able to self-medicate without actually like taking my emergency inhaler or whatever. So just to like calm down and then be able to sort of move past it. But there's definitely times I've had asthma attacks after a show and I've had to use, inhalers and stuff. Never to the point where it was a hospital visit, but
right.
I can empathize with your feeling of not being really ready for where that could take you. You said you started to get into punk and hardcore, whatever you'd like to call it. What was your entry point? Like who showed it to you? Did you have brothers and sisters? And what was your sort of family structure like growing up?
No, I was the only child growing up. I think if you were just a kid in the mid 80s, it would be very hard to not have that intersect your life at some point. I just feel like I picked it up by osmosis. In ninth grade, I went to school, this really crazy hippie school in Vermont. So it was a boarding school. Boarding, in the loosest term, we lived out in the woods in this weird barn. It was very strange. Take a lot of context. And two of the kids there were in the dead Kennedys.
Oh, okay.
I went through a long period, what feels long because it's my childhood, but only a couple months, 2-3 months, where I was violently opposed to the dead Kennedys, and I tried to convince them that they'd been duped because this band were actually Nazis because they had the word Nazi in a song. And, just like my logic centers were a little off.
Well, you're probably just being contrarian to be contrarian.
Yeah, I was 14. It was a confusing time.
Sure.
And then eventually got into them. There were some local Vermont hardcore bands. And so by the time I went back down to Albany to start a different school in 10th grade, I knew all the main bands, and a lot of my friends there were already plugged into that pretty natural progression. Although I remember going to my first show, it was really, really loud. It was disorienting how loud it was. Yeah, and still to this day, I wear earplugs at anything. I never stopped wearing earplugs. I'm the only one, probably my age, who doesn't have some hearing problems.
Whether or not that was foresight, that was just prudent move for you because people lose their hearing in what we've done over the years.
Yeah, I was never able to sing without earplugs. It was the weirdest thing. I only had a couple shows where they fell out, and it was an instant through line back to that first show of just incredible disorientation, extremely unpleasant. Like the curtain had been pulled back. This horrible thing I was actually involved in, closer to being in the engine room of a giant ship or something than actual fun.
Yeah, you needed some buffer between that, and those earplugs were obviously the main resistance for that. That's interesting. So what did your parents do as you were growing up, like for a profession?
My dad was a journalist at the time. My mom's an artist, still is an artist. They were as supportive, I think, as parents should be of someone getting into hardcore punk. I think they probably figured out pretty quick that all the straight edge stuff was keeping me out of a whole
bad influence, sure,
teenagerdom that I could have fallen into, and they're probably happy with that. I mean, I was a shitty kid as a teenager. A lot of times, I was a jerk. Didn't need any drugs to go in that direction. So, we had a normal relationship. I get along with him great now. Things got a little tense a couple times, but I don't think they had any problems with the shows I was going to. And the scene in Albany was very different from most scenes in America in the 80s. It was really tame. I didn't really have a full concept of the fact that there were fights at shows for years. I had to move to New York for college to really realize that was actually a thing.
Yeah.
Everyone was very tight-knit. There was a a scene phone list of just, hey, here's everyone's phone number because we're all friends.
Yeah, I think that sentiment rings true for most, and I'm going to use a music industry term here, for most quote unquote B markets. You have your towns that are large enough to obviously be able to sustain some level of culture, but not large enough in the way that you're saying that outside influences like violence could really perpetuate because everyone would completely squash it and be like, knock it the fuck off. Like, this is what we have up here.
Maybe. I don't know. I've seen some small town places where they definitely had serious problems. We would all go to Chuck E. Cheese after the shows. We'd play Duck Duck Goose on people's lawns. It was this really, it was nice. I'm really glad that I had this experience. In hindsight, it seems really intentionally hokey and almost kind of manufactured. And I think it was just the various people who were involved. It was just luck of the draw that in those couple of years, we were all really lucky. The same way that when I went to high school, I got a huge amount out of the school I was at just because of the people I was involved with. If I had been a year later or a year earlier, I wouldn't have gotten anything out of it like what I did get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Albany's a weird place in general.
Yeah, it is one of those cities where it's like it feels good. You know, I have no other better way to explain it other than just like are probably still remnants for what you were used to back then that still exists in some fashion now, where it's like, oh yeah, this is a nice city to get into music.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm baffled by Albany. I haven't been there in 10 years.
Sure. Your formative years in high school. So, like you said, you were, kind of a little shit. And did you care about school?
I started the first 5 years. I went to this really, really insane hippie school, far more insane than the one ninth grade. That would be very, very hard to fully describe. But a place that where there were just problems, full on no rules situation.
Okay.
I was there for 5 years, did 2 years in a very nice, sedate, suburban public school, 1 year at Hackett, which at the time, but maybe still is, was pretty notorious, very tough inner city junior high. Did a year in military school, then a year at the hippie school up in Vermont. In high school, for the last 3 years, I was at a really nice Christian prep school in Albany. And that school was where I met a lot of the people that really had a huge influence on me. And I didn't go into it feeling like I was someone who applied myself much, but I definitely my horizons broadened while I was there. So I wound up reading a lot more. In general, my mind opened up at that place a lot.
You were seeing the world beyond what was just kind of right in front of you.
Yeah.
The way that you're describing all of your schooling experiences, and this is coming from my own perspective, it's like my mom is a high school English teacher and grown up around the schooling system beyond just the one I experienced. You experienced the fucking gamut from one end to another end. Was that really difficult for you to keep shifting these completely alternate universes?
Yeah, at the time. I'm really glad I had the experience. Now, I don't know anyone else has had that wide a range.
Right.
Almost everyone I know had a bad time in high school, or they look back at high school, maybe everyone has some fondness, or they have some little corner of high school. And even when I was in Born Against, I fell into that pattern because that's how everyone else would talk about how horrible high school is. Born Against even has a song about how bad high school was,
right,
based mostly off of Adam's experiences. I had a blast in high school, not just because of my friends, but because I felt my mind jumped a step, and I was able to start processing things more. I mean, I tell there's a lot of parts of my childhood, I guess, that seem weird now, and I tell people about them, and they have an odd reaction, and then I think, oh yeah, I guess
that is weird. Yeah,
I guess there's some weird stuff. It feels to me like everyone in their life has just things in their childhood they think back on years later, like, I don't know, you're in your 20s and then you realize, like, oh, I guess I was kidnapped that one time. I never thought about that.
Yeah.
Or stuff like, oh, wow, yeah, that kid died. That's the weirdest thing. I totally forgot about that. And that's what my childhood feels like. But there are some parts that are strange. I had all those schooling experiences. I wrote a little bit about this. I wrote a piece in the Fader about being a published author at 12.
Right.
Was an odd experience. And then also that came out of the first school that I went to in Albany, the crazy hippie school. Mm-hmm. And the person I wrote the book with was a friend of mine who was a lot older than me. And then also later, he started dating my mom and has now been married to my mom for, I think, 25 years at this point.
Wow.
And that's just, I don't think twice about that story at all. And then every now and then I'll, retell it. People will say, oh, that's kind of unusual. And I say, I guess it was.
the environment that you're raised in is, it is what it is. Like, obviously you can't change it because you are a product of that. But all those experiences just seem very commonplace until you have the proper context to reflect upon it. Then you're like you said, you're like, oh yeah, that is strange.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as you started to transition into, the idea of wanting to play in a band, like once you started to go to shows, and obviously that was your experience, that was like what you wanted to do. Like, you wanted to sing for a band. You felt that passionate about it.
Yeah, but I think that's honestly, think back on all your friends. I would bet that the majority of your friends are in bands. The majority of my friends have been in bands. Everyone I know has been in bands. That's like a template for what people do, the same way that people used to join the military or the merchant marines, or middle of the country, they become farmers.
Right.
I mean, that is just what one does. And it wasn't so much that I felt a particular calling or anything. It was just that, it would be nice for me to do this thing that everybody else I know is doing. And also, I don't play any instruments. Therefore, my only choice to be a singer.
Right.
And I use singer in quotes because I can't hold a note. A guy with a microphone who screams.
The conductor of said band.
Yeah.
A majority of your touring years was like kind of late 80s, early 90s. And I'm addressing, obviously, Born Against in particular, toured with, Men's Recovery Project and Wrangler Brutes and stuff like that. Because each of those were obviously completely different experiences, the touring life changed so much over those years. Especially the jump from Men's Recovery Project to Wrangler Brutes. Do you look back wistfully on the Born Against years of touring, or do you look back on the touring you did with Wrangler Brutes, where it's like, okay, like this is maybe easier or better, to use those terms lightly?
I look back on all of those tours. Regret's not the right word, but I look back on Born Against tours and I get really scared for myself, because we willingly placed ourselves in a lot of dangerous situations, and the fact that almost none of those panned out danger-wise was, again, just luck. There were a lot of things where we probably should have gotten beaten up, and because of one factor we didn't. Someone was late to the beating, or
right.
or our friend showed up. And it just is so dumb. It's so pointless to expend that much effort to take stances on things that are manufactured concepts. I'm sure that you're familiar with all the less sane parts of the Born Against experience.
Of course.
But there are a bunch. And one of the things that's weird to me about that band now is mostly Born Against has benefited from time. Our recorded output doesn't contain the worst parts of what that band did. But just as people, nobody was thinking properly all the time. There were gaps. We went nuts over barcodes, but barcodes isn't, who cares? That's
right.
That's not a real thing.
No.
And that's a very, very serious thing. On par with if you had a swastika on your record, it would be the same thing as if you had a barcode, and that doesn't make sense to me now. And so when I look back on that experience, there is a lot of cringing. Just, I did that, or ouch, why, don't. Like, I could see myself like, don't, young man, don't do that. Versus other band experiences, especially Wrangler Brutes, just seem like, I don't know, it just seems like wasted time. It makes me sad that it's a waste of resources in a way. I don't mean the band itself. I mean being on tour.
Right.
Our big goal, which we actually more or less pulled off, which was to always be a good band live. Mm-hmm. That's still, I guess you could say, in that context, that's a laudable goal, maybe, because Born Against certainly didn't do it. That's so energy intensive and so time intensive. You only realize later, like, this is it. There's only so much lifespan you get, and you can spend it doing something real in so many different directions, or you can spend it driving from South Dakota to North Dakota and then playing a show in North Dakota to 28 confused people, and have a teenage Nirvana band open for you. And maybe that's kind of funny, but not really worth the drive funny,
Right. Not really worth the, 3 weeks of touring you've done up to that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bands in general are just a wasteful concept on so many levels. I get why I was in bands, and I get why other people are in bands. I don't look back on myself as stupid. It wasn't a stupid decision, and I certainly don't look down on anyone who's in bands now.
Right.
But at the same time, overlaid on top of that, it's it's a bizarre concept to me. Bands don't really make sense. And that aspect of it, the wastefulness, and I don't even just mean like the carbon footprint or whatever. I just mean time in terms of human labor. It's very strange to me that I did that for so long.
Right. Well, the most non-renewable resource of all, which is time, and that's obviously something that you feel like during those years you feel like you have a never-ending supply of it. But then when you actually, when you actually get away from it, it's like, oh yeah. No, that maybe that wasn't the best use of my time from that perspective.
Yeah. Oops.
Yeah.
Especially in vans. I mean, I tried so hard throughout all my touring. So from 1990 through 2004, I tried really hard in every form of transportation to just make use of that time and to read, and I just was never able to do it. You're at the mercy of whatever tape someone is playing, whatever amoebic CD they decide to put on. Even there were a couple tours I went on into Japan. I thought, oh, this is great. I have this 10-hour flight each way. I can get some reading in. There was one trip to Japan, a flight in 2002, where I brought, hold on, I'm going to pull this out. How many fucking pages is this? A History of Israel, From the Rise of Zionism to Our Time. This book, which I did wind up reading years later, it is 1,150 pages long. It's the size of a phone book.
Yeah.
I bought this thing that I'm holding it with two hands right now because it's big.
Mm-hmm.
I brought it in my bag to Japan thinking, what? Like I'm that kind of person. Like, oh, some light reading.
I'll knock this out.
Yeah, and then maybe like the stewardess will come by and like, oh, I see that's quite a book, and like, what the fuck is wrong with me? Why would I do that, And also on that flight, I remember very specifically, I watched Men in Black 2 4 times, and then I went to sleep and I woke myself up snoring, and that was the entire experience. Trying really hard to make that work and never getting it and being confused. Why won't this work? And the answer now is because it's a flawed system. You can't do that and get out of it the time that you're putting into it.
Really glad you're talking about this. I distinctively have noticed in my years of being in part of this culture or whatever, you definitely have your people in the band who are like, the sort of whatever, the business guy, the guy that, settles at the end of the shows or whatever. And that's the person, it sounds like yourself, who it's like, there's a certain level of ambition. Yeah, you want to do these things and you want to accomplish whatever, small goals you may have. And then obviously you have your people that play in bands who are just like, oh, dude, I just love to jam or whatever, And those are the people who obviously I don't think have those, and no slight against them, they just don't have those thoughts, everything that you're talking about. They don't have those thoughts. It's like,
well, what they have is motive. And if you find yourself without motive, that can be a really grim thing. If you're in a parking lot in Iowa and suddenly you have that realization, as many people in bands on tour have had, where you're standing there and you think, why am I doing this? There's no pay involved. In fact, I'm actually losing work time and I have to figure out some way to pay my rent on my apartment back home. What's my motive for doing this? And at least if you are a musician, if you play an instrument, that goes a long way. At least this is practice. I'm learning how to do these songs live. I'm learning how to be in a band. There are all these avenues that are open for you that aren't open for a frontman. There's no listing on Craigslist for grown men who scream. That's not a job description. I can't get any work based on being able to strike good poses in front of a microphone. I wasn't building anything, it was just an artistic act that had no endpoint. And that, I think that can get really scary really quick.
The trope that happens as people grow older, where it's like, you turn into the old man, get off my lawn sort of scenario. But the way that you speak about it, it's like, it's in reverence, but the reverence is not without perspective, I guess. And that's nice. That's refreshing for me to hear personally, because obviously it's like, once you hit like 25 and are expected to sort of cash out of this world, there are certain people that don't do that and still want to create art in various capacities, not turn into that, old person. It's like, oh, the fucking kids and this is stupid and blah, blah, blah. But so that's good.
Jesus, dude. Try being a 44-year-old man. That voice is always, it's like a drumbeat in my head. The old feel it, the ossification that just happens where where I live, so I live in Pomona, California now. There's a club. It's a mile away from my house. And because of the very particular layout of where my house is, at the end of a street, acoustically, I can hear what's happening at this club, which is a mile away. I mean, I can hear what people are saying on stage. That's every Friday and Saturday night. If you go next door to my house, 25 feet in either direction, you can't hear it. It's just physically where my house is located. And I'll feel that thing on Fridays and Saturday nights. I'm just saturated with hate for these people in their bands on stage at this club. And I feel like a character, I feel like the Grinch, you know? I'm just up here in my cave and it's dark in my house and I'm just wringing my hands and you know, like I got my head tilted forward and my eyebrows are all curled down. And it's that thing. It's that old man pull. And it's nice being conscious of that. I would like to not wind up like that. It's a hard lens through which to view one's past, especially my past.
Yeah. It strikes me as even more funny, the fact it's still so well documented in regards to like, oh yeah, Born Against, like they just, you know, they started shit. It's like, dude, have you watched that YouTube video of them debating Sick of It All? Or not YouTube video, but the radio interview. And it's like, that still exists. And it's like, that happened so long ago. Like you said, it gets perpetuated because obviously people revel in the idea of conflict and how interesting that is.
Yeah, that's the internet. I mean, anyone's past is going to get conflated with their present. All you can do is add to your eternal present online. One of the things that's weird to me about Born Against now, again, this is almost 20 years after we broke up, the degree to which the band is a blank canvas for the listener. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's not quite the precise analogy. Maybe the degree to which the band is an inkblot test. A lot of people who pay attention to that band see what they want to in that band. So, for example, Born Against is remembered now as this very strident left-wing punk band in the vein of all the 1990s politically conscious subcultures, some of which the band was a big influence on, when really what Adam and I wanted to be was a wackadoo band from the 1980s. And our priority was making people angry, which means making everyone angry. Mm. And we loved making fun of leftists. The band had 2 songs directly attacking people on the left, one of which, the song I Am an Idiot, which is on the split with UOA, mm-hmm. clearly mocked Occupy Wall Street, 18 years before Occupy Wall Street existed.
Right.
Strange to me, I've read a fair amount of stuff online where people assume that whatever their very specific, isolated political take is, that's something that A, Born Against would have approved of, and B, by the transitive property, I myself would approve of because I am currently the singer of Born Against.
Right. Right.
It's what's weird to me now is that everyone who likes Born Against thinks that they were in on the joke, but no one was in on the joke.
Oh, sure.
We went after everyone, including ourselves. A mess, and the bad kind of mess, the one that starts with the audience chuckling and ends with people walking out the door feeling disrespected and abused. And some of that aesthetic was borrowed from the early 80s hardcore bands that we admired, but some of it was just an expression of, honestly, mental illness. Mm-hmm. A lot of it mine. I had a lot of problems when I was in that band. Other people in the band were struggling with their own issues. And so it's strange to me. Again, I'm happy that the band has mostly benefited from time. Far more people like that band than are upset by the worst stuff that we did. And most of the worst stuff we did is gone. It's been vaporized. It never made it onto the internet. I don't really know how that happened.
Yeah.
And for the time being, I'm not going to draw attention to it. Although if I can find an interesting way to write about it, I probably will eventually. But it's weird to me that all the people who like it feel that they have this this fellowship with the band, when that's not really openly, that's not what the band's aesthetic was. If there was a time machine and a person in their 20s now, went back, was able to go back in time 22 years and see the band, the odds are at best 50-50 that any of us would have been nice to that person. It's not like they would go to one of these shows and revel, all of us, in the majesty of whatever it was we were celebrating. They would go and be abused and mocked and humiliated by us. And that was the point of what we were doing. Again, that's the nature of mental illness. Like, it was not a pleasant experience to be in, and often I don't think was a pleasant experience to witness.
Yeah. Completely leads into the idea of why would you guys reunite and play another show? Because like you said, it's not like you would try to recreate that experience. If you were to do something like that, why would you even do that in the first place? Because that isn't even necessarily the point of why you did the band in the first place. Like,
yeah, that's always a strange thing. Like, I mean, I haven't read tons of clamor for people wanting to get Born Against together, but I read a little bit.
Yeah.
And whenever I see them, I'm just like, really? Like, you would want that? You would want to see flabby 44-year-old man try to recreate emotions that make no sense to him anymore, to do a lot of things that were directly influenced by profound mental illness.
right.
Like, why would that be fun? You know?
Yeah. I don't think people ever reflect on the idea of, I guess, context. They just think that it's like, oh, well, because I would be able to see this live, like that would be meaningful.
Yeah.
Whether or not that would actually be something that's quantifiably good, that's almost irrelevant when you talk about reunions.
Yeah, context is such a weird thing now. It's the strangest thing that shift. I have a friend who goes to a lot of hardcore shows now, and she was over here, closer friend with my wife, but I'm friends with her too. And she came over, and I was taking out the trash or something, and I saw she had a negative approach sticker on the back of her car, and I came in, and wow, you actually literally have a negative approach sticker on the back of your car. They're a very good band. I don't even know what I mentioned it. I don't know.
Right.
She said, yeah, I'm really bummed I didn't get to see them. And I said, oh, me too. For me, meaning like, I'm bummed that I was born 5 years too late. I really would have liked to have seen them. And I realized what she meant was, I'm bummed I didn't get to see them when they played Pomona. They're both equally valid thoughts, but it's strange to me that it took a jump for me to figure out the way that she meant it, and which was completely different from the way that I meant it. And it's strange to me that I could see people enjoying seeing Negative Approach now, but personally, just for myself, I can't imagine anything less fun. And that's also when this spurt of band reunions really kicked in 4 years ago, less than 5 years ago, from
Yes.
really went into overdrive. I remember saying, listen, if Negative Approach comes back, maybe I would consider seeing them. My bluff was called. They played, I don't know, a mile from. They probably played in that fucking club down the street. Yeah, so I don't know. That was an odd moment for me, and I don't look down. I have tons of my friends. Most of my friends from peers is a weird word, but all the bands that were part of the crowd that Born Against was part of have reunited, and I don't begrudge them any of that. I can't imagine wanting to do that.
Right. You never made a living off of music, like you said. It's like you're making rent when you came home from tour. Was
well, with one exception, I did for a while. Vermiform made enough money. I mean, that was my job for years, and I just lived very cheaply, especially in Richmond. When I moved to Richmond, Virginia in '93, when Born Against was over, my rent was $95 a month. So it was maybe not 5 years, but I went for a while where that was my occupation. So in a way, I was making money off music.
Right. You were in the industry rather than a participant in the other.
Lowest rung. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Me being from Southern, or mostly raised in Southern California, and obviously seeing labels like Ebullition and Vermiform, like once those things came into my purview, and understanding the idea of like that takes no effort to put together. Like, obviously, it takes financial resources and, sweat equity and all those things that, you don't consider. Those labels and what you did obviously made those things, a little more tangible for people to kind of like be able to pull down and understand that like, oh, yeah, like I can just put this out on my own. It can hopefully be able to, like you said, sustain you as long as you're comfortable with like, oh, yeah, I'm just above the poverty line.
Yeah, it's doing a record label has an element of a self-inflicted pyramid scheme on it, because if you're doing one that's not totally snidey whiplash style, you're going to pay people royalties on it, which means that for every dollar you generate, a certain hard-to-determine proportion has to go right back out the door to the artists. And I was able to do that for a long time, but when the company folded, not all the payments got made. There were some people who were left holding the bag. There was nobody who got nothing. Everybody was paid 3/4 of the way through that company. But it's a shitty business model, just aside from what the business is. Any money you get is not ever entirely yours.
Right.
Most of the labels that I knew from that period found a very elegant way around that problem, which was to just not pay royalties. That's not always a bad way to do things if you're doing really small pressings of stuff, or if you're really good about paying people in merchandise. The problem is once you start paying royalties. Once you make that first payment, then you're locked in. No one's going to forget that. I've had labels since that owe me tiny little payments, and if I need $100, I'm going to remember that, hey, maybe they owe me $40 and I need to get that from them.
Right.
Yeah, as a way to do business, it's not good.
And so, like I said, in the context of you making a living off of the label for a while, as that started to become less apparent that you could do that, did you immediately go back to the idea of like, okay, I like to write, I want to see if I can make this into a thing for myself?
The progression on that was kind of convoluted. I had a lot of odd jobs and then also full-time jobs sometimes while I was doing the label. It never occurred to me when I was doing columns, like I would do columns for Punk Planet and get paid $50.
Mm-hmm.
That transition was something that was really alien and strange to me, and I had no idea what I could write about. You know what? I never thought about that, but there's a parallel there, which is that when I very first started doing fanzines, the first fanzine I did in Albany, so from 85 to 86, I had several sessions of working on the fanzine with my fanzine partner, Jason, and we tried to figure out what we would write in this fanzine. It was mostly art and just cartoons and stuff. And I remember thinking, like, what would you write in a fanzine? Like, what is there to say? That it just seemed like a very alien concept. And I think that's how it was 10 years later. Well, no. 2003, 2004, where I just wasn't like, what? Okay, I could write, but what would I write? What am I qualified to write? And that kind of kept me back some. I did a review for the OC Weekly under a fake name of the Wrangler Brutes record. I trashed the Wrangler Brutes record. Did that and got paid for it, which was nice, although I think that just went straight into the band fund for some reason. I don't remember why.
Yeah.
Through that contact, I then got more music writing work. And not all the pieces were great, but there were a couple good pieces, and I definitely learned some very important things. Learned how to work with an editor, and then through that work, got work in other weeklies, because that's kind of a circuit. Orange County Weekly is owned by the company that owns Village Voice, and the LA Weekly.
Right.
Realized that was something maybe I can do, although even then I was fuzzy on the concept of what I would do outside music writing. It's kind of a punchline now, because clearly, if you read any of my music pieces, I'm not qualified to be a music writer in any possible way. I can't do it. But in that, I got myself a ticket out to Detroit, and I did a long piece with Doc Dart, the frontman for the Crucifix, and did a 8,000 word piece, originally an 11,000 word piece, and then it got trimmed down to 8,000 words. Spent a week out there interviewing him because he's had a really, really insane life. It was a really good story, and I knew that no one had gotten to that yet, and really threw myself at that as hard as I possibly could, and got a really good piece out of it. Shopped that around to a lot of places, still didn't really know how to do that, didn't know how the mechanics of that would work, and so it just fell flat. I got a few rejections. Most magazines, I don't know, who did I approach? Spin.
Yeah.
Magazines it wasn't appropriate for anyway, just said, no, this isn't something we wanted. And I had a contact with Vice magazine. They had contacted me years earlier. When I was in Wrangler Brutes, none of us liked Vice at all. We were very dead set against that magazine. And so I'd sort of poo-pooed that contact. And I took a second look at it, and I thought, well, maybe this would be a good place for that piece. And I recontacted Jesse, a friend of mine who was the editor at the time, and sold it there. And that was my entry really into doing what I'm trying to do now, which is journalistic pieces, long-form pieces, ones that I guess could be called human interest, not music pieces.
Right.
And so in doing that, then I've been able to branch out to other magazines. That was, I guess, my entry point into that world.
Sure.
Definitely wasn't something that I consciously set out to do, which seems strange to me now, but it's like everything else in your past. You look back on it and you want to retrofit all these motives and thoughts. I tried to do commercial writing for years. Commercial writing is I'm looking at my two books right now. Commercial writing is just doing copywriting for other companies, and I set up my own copywriting company, and all this is writing press releases, doing text for websites. I noticed more and more in the jobs that I had, both temp jobs, full-time jobs, part-time jobs, and all of these, the boss and everyone else hated doing the writing. If they had to do a brochure, they just were cringing doing it. I said, well, I'll do it. That's nothing. I'll knock that out before lunch. It's, 3 paragraphs? Mm-hmm. And everyone was baffled that it wasn't a problem for me and it was a problem for them. So there is a world in that. You can get paid a lot of money as a copywriter. And that's what I tried to do all through the mid-aughties was get work as a copywriter. And I got no jobs. I did 0% return. I mailed up mailings. I did hundreds of cold calls. I just the other day threw out all my beautiful business cards that are embossed, this beautiful logo I made. I just couldn't make it work, you know? And now that seems obvious to me that would fail. But at the time, that seemed like a really rational way to go.
Yeah. I think the key word you use there is rational. It's like, I definitely find when it's like, whatever artistic endeavor you're trying to put forth, when you do put like this level of rational thought into like, okay, I'm going to craft this in order to be a part of whatever it is that I'm trying to do, whatever larger thing you're trying to accomplish. That's usually when it's like, those are the things that end up like, such as your experience, where it's like, yeah, it kind of falls flat, where it just doesn't, you can't get anything going because, you know, it might not come from the most, you know, I guess feel good places, where it's just like, no, I'm doing this because I think this is what I probably should do because I have a proficiency with this. I think once you've done it once, you learn from that process and you're like, okay, that's not something.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope I've been learning from my mistakes. There've been a lot.
And so that, you know, that kind of brings us to where you're at now, where it's like, you released a book last year. That was your first fiction work, correct?
First novel published. I've had a couple short stories published.
And I was combing through some of that, you know, I know in some of the interviews that you did around when the book was released and stuff like that. One of the key elements that I pulled out that I wanted to talk to you about was the idea that a continued theme that I've noticed, obviously, in your work, not only in the book, but the stuff you've created prior to this, anger. You know, how you're focusing this rage into this character and bleeds out into everything else you've done prior to that. Never spoken to you before, but there's no sense of rage I get during this there are elements of that are evident throughout your work. Is that something that just continually informs you because you've been so well versed at it over the years?
No, so the book, The Loom of Ruin, is about the angriest man in the world. I honestly didn't make any possible connection between that and the Born Against experience until well into the book tour.
Right.
There's a whole other novel I have before that one that has none of those elements in it. But my first novel, the one that's not published, didn't work as a book. It needs something that's not there. I think it's a very common experience. I'm finding more and more. There are a lot of people who get published who have that first book that just doesn't work and sits in a drawer somewhere. So this one, I wanted to write a really good, solid novel that moved really fast and had a lot of yucks in it. And for some reason, that idea struck me. I want to say kind of a coincidence. I wrote about the angriest man in the world, and I was in this band that was one of the angrier bands of that era, going well into caricature. Although certainly there were times in Born Against where we all made fun of the way we were perceived anyway. It wasn't a one direction caricature of angry people. Yeah, no, I don't think that's actually a theme in my work. I think it's just a bizarre, weird thing that happened timing-wise in my writing
life.
I don't want to say writing career. I feel like a cheese bag whenever I say my writing career. There's a couple days ago I had to go back to drop our car off at the dealership because there was a recall thing on the steering wheel or whatever. And so then they sent the shuttle a few hours later, and the shuttle came to my house, and I drove back, and there was this girl. I mean, she was a girl. She was a teenager. She probably barely had her driver's license, and so it was me and her, and she's driving back, and it was really awkward, not because I'm a middle-aged man and she's a teenage girl, and maybe if I was a teenage girl, I certainly wouldn't want to be trapped in a van with a 44-year-old man. It wasn't exactly that. It was more, or that I was old enough to be her dad. It wasn't that. It was that she was so painfully earnest. You could tell this job was new to her. She was not a good driver. Every sentence ended with the word "sir," and so somehow, in this really short, 2 exits on the freeway, in this short drive, they came up like, "Oh, what do you do for a living, sir?" And I said, "Well, I'm a writer." And I thought, that's a weird thing to say. That's awfully presumptuous of me to say that I'm a writer. But
right.
Like anything else, they're like, "Oh, I'm a writer." And she's like, "Oh, what do you write?" And she got really, really excited. I was like, "Well, I had, my first published novel came out last year." And she's like, "Oh my God." I thought she'd hit something. "Oh my God, that's incredible." And I thought, is it? Am I jaded? Why? It was really, really goddamn awkward. I didn't know what to say. And all I could think when I got out of the van at the dealership like totally flustered from this conversation. It's like I need to really I need to work on my social skills still, but also B, like I need to figure out some graceful way to talk about whatever it is I do where I don't sound embarrassed or weirded out by it, which is still kind of the case.
Well, yeah, because you're still in a similar experience. I always look at, when you are traveling internationally, and obviously it asks your profession, and anytime, especially people that work in the creative fields that aren't working for like some major corporation where it's easy to describe, you're just like, oh, I guess I'm a musician, but I feel like a fucking tool. Right.
I've had that conversation. That's terrible.
Yeah, you feel like a tool because you're just like, well, no, I mean, I'm in a band, but that doesn't mean I'm like a musician. Like that, that I put people like Yngwie Malmsteen as a musician. Like he's a musician, I'm not. But yeah, I think it's just a matter of like you trying on this new suit and you're like, oh, I don't necessarily feel like this fits, but like you said, it's just a matter of kind of tailoring it, and then you'll wear it and be like, okay, yeah, I am a writer, like this is me.
There was a time maybe 10 years ago I learned a lot about the refrigeration industry, so that if I was on a flight or somewhere else and a stranger asked me what my occupation was, I could say, oh, I'm in refrigeration, and then just tell them all about the refrigeration business and why they need to upgrade to such and such, and oh, well, there's your problem, that's got the old type of coils, and here's what you want, da-da-da-da-da. And
that's
I
incredible.
learned all this stuff. I never had it. And then like I was waiting for people to ask me, and no one ever asked. And then eventually it just like, it just left my brain, and it's all gone. I'd have to start.